Good afternoon, everybody, and you're very welcome to today's meeting to launch Ludger Schuknecht's new analysis, Preparing for Economic Recovery, More Market, Better Government.
Yeah, thank you, Sheila. I'm very happy to be in this panel. It's a very great honor. Now, I think there are now that we are heading into the phase where we're all looking forward to the vaccination against COVID. I think it's a good time to take stock what the challenges for the medium term are, what the challenges are to make sure that the recovery is a success. And for that, I think it's worthwhile doing a bit of analysis and soul searching where we stand, and to base this discussion on the post-COVID challenges on facts and analysis rather than on myth and speculation. And I think that this transition, so to speak, from crisis thinking to more structured strategic thinking is very important. Right now, a lot of people are still focusing, on the question: do we need more stimulus, additional ones? Where are we? How much more of this should we do? Do we need more government because the markets have failed, so we need more government to do we need to have more government to deal with health issues and whatnot. And I would say that my analysis should hopefully convince you that we should really take a more medium-term approach and focus on three issues. First, to deal with low economic and productivity growth and low investment. Second, to deal with weak public finances. And third, to deal with protectionist threats that are mushrooming around us. And I call this the triangle of stability. Strong growth potential, sound public finances, and high quality public finances, and open economies. On this slide, you see what has happened over recent decades. Potential trend growth and labor productivity have declined, and it is not clear where we will be post-COVID. And while we have rightly engaged in a lot of stimulus policies from finance ministries and central banks during the crisis, this is not something that we should sustain. And at the latest, when the crisis is over, we need to change tack, and we need to think about how to get growth back on track, how to get our economies to prosper again, and that all in a sound and sustainable environment. Now, just maybe as a little illustration, we have quite some economists arguing right now that we have the savings glut. Now, from an accounting perspective, investment weakness or savings glut is really kind of the same. You have a deficiency of demand. But if you look at the numbers, I think what is striking is really the decline in investment in the past 20 years and already over the longer run. This is not a trend that just emerged in the 2000s. And the magnitude is also striking. I mean, like in the euro area, Japan, US, it's 2% of GDP. That's a huge decline. UK and Germany, the decline was less, but still also in the magnitude of 1 percentage point of GDP if you look at like decade averages. So what I think is a key challenge here to get growth and productivity up is to have, again, a favorable investment environment and private investment environment, because private investment is responsible for 85 to 90% of total investment. And that, so to speak, resuscitation of confidence and private investment would also help with issues of demand shortfalls and demand shortages that many people are concerned about. Now, what in a way accompanies weak investment is concern about something that is casually often referred to as zombification. Zombification of industry versus a dynamic environment where where new companies, new productive companies replace old and failing ones. And it's clear that in a low interest environment, this process of failing companies being replaced by new, more productive ones is slowing down, because it's easier for companies to stay afloat when interest rates are very low, and it's easier also for banks to prevent, to kind of forbear and not write off the loans to weak companies. So already an OECD study from 2017 showed that zombification after the global financial crisis had a significant negative effect on productivity and investment, because these low productivity firms stayed in business. And there is a risk that this process will become worse, or is becoming worse with COVID, because we are guaranteeing all kinds of firms, and the interest environment hasn't changed. So there is a chance that post-COVID, if we don't pay attention, if we don't let the market determine who is viable, that then we'll have even more zombies that prevent productive firms from entering, and that means less investment, less growth. Now, in that context, I think it is also important to emphasize that private investment needs a favorable investment environment. Now, this is really the basics of the role of the state in creating an environment, favorable framework conditions for private investment. And sometimes, over all the discussion of stimulus and fine-tuning, we lose sight of the basics. And while for the US and the UK, some of these indicators are still quite good. For instance, this is the ease of doing business ranking by the World Bank, where the UK and the US rank 6th and 7th. Already for Japan, for Germany, Canada, Japan, this is not quite as good. And if you look here at Italy and Greece, they are really, far off rank 70, 60, and close to 80 in this doing business ranking of the World Bank. But what does it mean? What it means is that in many of our countries, the procedures are just too cumbersome for public and private investors to get the money on the road, to get new processes, new firms, to get these investments actually in place. Just an example, in Germany now, building a windmill takes 6 years because of the procedures involved, rather than the 6 months it used to take and it should take because of the construction needs. So this investment environment, I think, is still something that many countries need to work on. And another element here, to my mind, to discuss reforms for is the education and skills environment of our economies. Now, again, this is very basic, but there's a huge correlation between growth, long-term growth, and education competencies, PISA especially. But also now digital skills are becoming more important. Lifelong learning is becoming more important because people have to work longer. So on this chart, you see that the share of individuals with adequate digital problem-solving skills, even in the best performing countries like Sweden and the Netherlands, is less than half. And then you go down the ranks. The UK 1/3, Germany very similar, and you have countries doing even more poorly. So, and if you look at PISA scores and some of this, this package of education and skills-related scores, you'll find that in many ways the Asian countries are now on top. Singapore, Korea, parts of China, Japan, Taiwan. On PISA, Finland and Estonia can still keep up. So the Nordics are not bad in general, but here for the UK, Germany, this is a real challenge. I mean, so this is about, in a way, government also here creating the framework conditions, to my mind, for a good education and skills environment, where also the private sector has a very important contribution. Let me get to the second element of the triangle of stability, as I call it. Besides growth and productivity at home, it's to create an international environment which is conducive to growth and jobs. Now, here you see the two charts show how much domestic value added is in others' imports and how much foreign input is there in our manufacturing. One refers, so to speak, if others are protectionist, you know, how is it going to affect the outsiders? And the second one is, you know, if others become protectionist, how much is it going to hurt our producers because they rely on imported inputs? And in both cases, I mean, the figures are very high. You know, I mean, if look at the foreign input in our manufacturing for the UK, it's over 50%. So, you know, all these ideas of protectionism and autarky and renationalization, this might be in theory all very nice, but in practice, it could have a devastating effect if it affects important value chains. You see here in the next slide also, I called this the risk of stagflation because, you know, not only would it undermine production and cause inefficiencies, but also it would stoke inflation if we had protectionism on a significant scale. And one incidence where we could see this, observe this, is in spring when some countries started to impose export barriers on certain medical equipment, and prices went up by as much as 40%. Now, you know, if you look at the type of equipment here, macroeconomically, this is not very relevant, but if you had this at a more significant scale, it would be. Now, this last slide on the second challenge on open markets, I think is really my favorite. It shows you that even a moderate degree of protectionism and renationalization, tariffs of 25%, 1% of GDP to subsidize domestic production, and some obstruction to using imports, would have huge impacts on growth and on exports. In the case of the UK, it would be over 10% less growth, over 30% less exports. For Germany, it's 5%. The numbers are 5% and 10%, and that's similar to the rest of the world. And so I mean, renationalization is a woolly concept which some people opportunistically apply right now, but if that was really our future, then we would be in dire straits. Now, the third challenge is sustainable high-quality public finances. And of course, you know, if you have more growth and a bigger economy, the problem is less prevalent. So always kind of these three elements operate together, because if you have you know, a high debt ratio, but your economy grows well, then it's much more bearable than if it's the other way around, like, you know, compare Italy with very high debt and no growth. And, you know, then you have other economies where the situation is not quite as dire as regards growth. But if you look at this table, you'll see that already in 2007, we had an average debt ratio amongst G7 countries of over 80%. And this increased to 116% by 2019, just before the Corona crisis. And it had hardly come down after a peak of about 119. So this is the pattern. You have some crisis, some recession, debt jumps up. Then in the good times, here 2014 to 2019, debt doesn't go down. Now we have Corona. Average debt in the G7 goes up to almost 140%, which is basically the same level as in 1946 after the war. And we managed to do it without a war. So what is underlying this? Well, underlying this with the Corona pandemic is a very strong jump in public expenditure and deficits. Part of the expenditure jump is, of course, because expenditure relates to a smaller GDP, but part of it is also genuinely higher expenditure. And now, of course, some of this jump in 2020 will reverse in 2021 as we expect a recovery. But on the whole, if you look at this public expenditure ratios in 2020, over 60% in France, near 60% in Italy, over 50 in the UK and Germany, Canada, is just, these are expenditure ratios which are not financeable in the long run. And we have people who still ask for more public spending because they think with more spending you solve the problems of tomorrow. But here, I think it's important to keep another lesson in mind. That is, there is no, in many areas, there is no correlation between spending and performance. I just have here scatter plots on public education and PISA scores on the left, and health expenditure and a kind of a health performance score, which is basically referring to life expectancy and infant mortality, where 1 is the average. But if you use other inputs, the picture is not that much different. But I think what you can clearly see here is there is a cloud where the performance has little relation to spending. And for instance, in education, the best performers have actually the lowest public expenditure. And Canada and Finland, who perform similarly well, spend a lot more but don't get more money. In health, you have this cloud of observations where Germany has an average performance with very high spending. The US even less than average performance with very high spending, and Japan a very good performance with high spending, but Finland with medium spending. So all I'm trying to say is, we need better spending. We don't need necessarily more spending. And that's also the lessons of some of the episodes of more spending that we had in recent years. For instance, in Germany, in education, spending has been raised a lot, but PISA scores did not change. Because what you spend on is not necessarily what gives you better performance, better education. And then if you put all these indicators together, and there I make a little bit of an advertising also for a recent book of mine, Public Spending and the Role of the State, you look at the aggregate performance that's on the right. You see that countries like Switzerland, Australia, Ireland, they are doing very well, but they have very small public sectors. Well, then you have countries like France, Italy, Greece with relatively high public spending, and they are not doing very well. And if you just take as one example the development of per capita GDP, where in 2000, countries with small governments, less than 40% of GDP, and big government countries like Sweden, France, Denmark, had about the same per capita GDP in 2000. And now in 2020, 2017, that has really decoupled, where the lower growth becomes very visible. Now, let me conclude, because I think I'm out of time. The post-COVID recovery agenda should look at the triangle of stability, which means market-friendly policies with an investment-friendly environment, stronger education and training systems, and a return to the market principle for allowing firms to survive or not. Then on the trade side, keeping markets open and keeping nationalization of production to an absolute minimum. And as regards public finances, ensure that public finances stay sustainable and become better quality. And my suggestion would be to have rules-based policies, because rules are what helps to overcome human weaknesses, politicians' weaknesses in terms of deficit and debt biases. And we need this reform of public expenditure and return to sustainability, also for social reasons, because we are not going to master population aging, and we are not going to master the climate crisis with bankrupt governments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ludger. And congratulations also, not only on that, but on your new book, which is just out, Public Spending and the Role of the State, History, Performance, Risk and Remedies. I wish it every success. It's a great achievement, and it follows the work earlier with Vita Tanzi on public spending in the 20th century. So very good luck with it. Tim Congdon.
Okay, well, can I'm ready to go, Sheila?
Yes, please.
Okay, well, first of all, can I congratulate Ludger on both the pamphlet and also the presentation, and congratulate you on that, Ludger, and thanks to Politeia and Sheila for inviting me to participate in this webinar. Yes, the triangle of stability. Free markets, free trade, strong public finances. Yes, of course, I agree with all of that. And of course, it's back to the agenda of the 1980s when we remember we had Ronald Thatcher and Margaret Reagan running the world, if I can put it that way. And that was such a good time. And well, I might also say that kind of recalls the British Empire when we had laissez-faire and free trade and balanced budget as things that we had through decade after decade, and that was British Empire. But something else in British Empire was the gold standard. I would say that there is a sort of fourth side to the picture. We need to be kind of, I'm not sure if it's a quadrilateral or one talks about the square of stability, doesn't really work. But anyway, some sort of quartet anyway. And that is, we want to get, we need to have low money growth to achieve price stability. And we need to have stable money growth to have stable growth of demand and output. Now, I say those things at present because, well, I agree with Ludger that these ideas are being ignored or breached all over the place, that there are particular problems at the moment. The coronavirus has led to a sort of anarchic response on macroeconomic policy. One understands how these things have occurred, and one kind of understands how when lives are at stake, all of the rules are thrown out. And however, the fact of the matter is that in the year to June 2020, the growth of the quantity of money in the United States was 26%, which is the highest figure since 1943. In the Eurozone and the UK, the growth of money, I always talk about broad money, is in double digits. And we've just had in the UK another completely unnecessary burst of quantitative easing, which I think will take that figure up towards 15%. In the Eurozone, again, we're having unnecessary asset purchases on top of those that have already occurred, which will take money growth possibly towards 15%. Look, Ludger, you've shown very clearly the trend growth rate of productivity in the main countries now is only about 1%. We're coming into a period when the demographic challenges are getting much worse. The trend rate of growth of output in the main countries is only really 1%. At the moment, there's this blur because of COVID and so on. We're talking about money growth rates of 15% when there's 1% growth trend output. This must mean inflation. So I think there's a bit more to say here, and I'm very much on your side. I very much agree with what you're saying. How am I going for time, Sheila?
You're going fine, Tim. You've got another few minutes.
All right. Well, can I just say just a couple of notes of disagreement? One is, I'm not sure about this thing about capital spending. I spent much of when I was a young man believing in much more capital investment as a good thing. But then we have really the triumph of American capitalism in the last 20 years or so with their dominance of high tech. It's not because they're investing a lot in capital equipment. It's because they're skilled in developing new human capital, new software and so on. This is driven by all the incentives of the market economy, and my word, it's amazing how rich some of those billionaires are. But this is human capital. It's not capital equipment. To some extent, we have this in the UK as well. We've never been a big capital spending economy, but we have these clever lawyers, these clever accountants, these clever consultants who work in the City of London, and bankers and the rest of it. So I just would put that into the qualification, Ludger. And then the second thing I would say is,
Yeah.
This may strike you as a surprising comment, but I think we need to be careful about the zombification business. Look, there are many businesses that invest, they make a mistake, and they'll never recover the capital cost. But the receipts they get from the business exceed the variable cost. And what that means is these businesses should not be closed down. They should not be closed down. They should be left alone. And typically these businesses have a discussion with the bank manager. The capital spending was financed by the investor. They've lost the money, but they can service the debts. I think there should be far more respect by central banks, regulators, and so on. Leave the banks alone. There's too much intervention in what they do. And I'd say in particular, may I say here, the damage done by Basel III in the last decade is appalling. It was not necessary to react to the Great Recession in the way that they did. The imposition of these capital rules has been very damaging both to banking and their customers, including the small, medium-sized enterprises. I'm a small businessman myself. The cost of bank finance now is just utterly different from what it was 15 years ago. And it's those Basel rules that are causing the trouble.
Yeah.
Just finish by saying, Sheila, that I think one of the things about what's going on at the moment is we see these international bureaucracies, I include BIS, they're completely out of control. They're doing things they're not supposed to be up to. I see that the IMF is in favor of what they call it, quote here, this is the IMF blog, a green, job-rich global recovery. It is not the IMF's job to push this kind of thing. They're supposed to advocate sound public finances so the world moves towards greater freedom from exchange restrictions. That's what the IMF was supposed to do when it set up in the 1940s. Can I just say, finish off, Ludger, we're lucky to have, I use the expression, a civil servant of your caliber, your ability, talking to us today. This is an excellent study. I do wish there are more international civil servants of your caliber and quality. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Tim. Harold James, please, Harold. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, Politeia. It's a great pleasure to be here and to briefly talk about Ludger's really excellent paper, and also I think to advertise and celebrate Ludger's new book in which some of these issues are set out more clearly. I think the problem at the root of our discussion this morning is that we've got a short-term emergency which requires extraordinary measures, and the monetary reaction, the fiscal reaction to that seem to me to be absolutely appropriate. I think it's very rare. Maybe Tim is worried about that. I think it is right to be worried about the longer term consequences, and that's exactly the terrain into which Ludger's paper wants to take us. But the short term reaction is really appropriate. There's a colossal loss of jobs because of the disease and because of the shutdowns. And we know there's a lot of literature on how job losses can produce deep scarring and how the effect of recessions can go on through years and through generations. And so some of the themes that Ludger is sounding, in particular dealing with education effectively, because education is clearly one of the areas in which scarring is going to be most likely to occur, setting a roadmap for a better education system in the future, and the emphasis that Ludger had in his paper on the way in which the effectiveness of delivery is not really at all well correlated with the amount spent on it. So we're talking about ways of increasing productivity in education, but raising productivity in general. And that, it seems to me, is exactly where COVID creates an opportunity, that we've had experimentation with learning, with digital learning. A lot of it has been very poor, and part of the problem is also that poorer households find it difficult to get access to the internet, for instance, so the students are missing more of their classes than children from better off families. Those are the kind of issues that you really need to think of in terms of this long-term raising of productivity, raising attainment, raising the PISA scores. And the short-term reaction to the crisis will, I think, also shape the way in which the longer-term reaction plays out. And the same is true of medicine. There are dramatic new initiatives going on at the moment all over the place, but the UK is, I think, doing particularly well in some of those initiatives of moving away from traditional models of medical care and moving to telemedicine, moving to more delivery of medical services in the home. These are areas where there can be great cost savings, but in ways in which also medical facilities can be made more generally available. So, you know, what I think is impressive about Ludger's presentation is the way that it thinks about particular micro aspects of increasing longer-term productivity. And if you're thinking about those, crises are always a great opportunity, and this is an opportunity, I think, to get many of these things right. We're in an area in which administrations have to be more flexible. You know, I'm not sure about the business of applying rules in this, and you know, I recognize when Ludger says we need rules and they give social stability, but we have a lot of really pointless rules at the moment, and we need consistent rules, but we also need flexibility. And in terms of, for instance, giving better services, that requires really a flexibilization of rules. One final point, because it came in through this chat function of Zoom. There was a question from Thomas Pritchard, which I think is one which we should think about, because it's in the air everywhere. I've had many discussions like this, and there are people who are saying, Thomas Pritchard is saying in this chat function, that there's a big discussion of so-called modern monetary theory. And modern monetary theory says that you can throw all the rule books away and throw the rule books away that Tim pays attention to and Ludger pays attention to. Why don't we just finance everything through government debt? Because government debt is costless at the moment, or more or less costless at the moment. It's a very, very simple prescription, and it's getting a lot of political traction. So what's wrong with it? Well, what's wrong with it is exactly the last element that Ludger was thinking about in terms of openness. You can think of the modern monetary theory application really fundamentally only in a closed economy, and that's why it got some kind of advocates back in the 1970s when there were some people trying to make the UK into a siege economy. If you don't have any external trade, if you don't have an exchange rate, then some of the preconditions of modern monetary theory look as if they're applicable. But in a world in which there's an open economy, and we need it in order to supply the goods and to keep the supply chains opening, you will tip yourself into an area quickly in which government debt becomes impossible to finance, and you get back into, and Ludger already mentioned this, the stagflation of the 1970s. The 1970s are really a real danger in terms of our response to this crisis. And I think the mixture of trying to think about long-term ways out and ways of improving through particular micro-reforms, productivity growth, are the key to avoiding a repetition of that kind of era.
Thank you very much, Harold. Stephen Hammond, please.
Sheila, thank you very much for inviting me to say a few words, and thank you to Ludger for his excellent paper. I wanted to look at it probably mainly through a more political rather than economic context today, and I also wanted to say yeah, instinctively, all Conservatives are going to find this an appealing paper because it's talking about free market, smaller state, lower taxation, incentives to entrepreneurship. Much to welcome. So what I thought I'd do, if I may, is just pick out 3 or 4 highlights. I've got about 10, but I realise time is not going to allow that. In the first section, I rather agree with Ludger about zombification, because I think the concern here is the misallocation of capital, and it's a question of, even if there are a number of companies, because of and this is in the COVID context, but there are a number of companies, particularly in the UK context, where our support systems have kept companies alive through COVID, but inevitably that was going to put a strain on banks' balance sheets. And some of these companies probably will not, in a post-COVID world, because there will have been structural shifts and other economic shifts, be able to do what Tim challenged them to do, that if they are able to cover, if income covers their variable costs or all their costs, then that's fine. But if they are then, if there is then a misallocation because we're supporting companies that can't do that, and we saw this in the aftermath of the financial crisis, I think that will have ramifications for not only the misallocation, but the liquidity of capital. And so I'm afraid I think Ludger's hit on something that we should look at. And there is as many of you will know, a number of UK pieces on this. One I contributed to earlier in the summer, and also the City UK piece. And I think it's worth having a look at that point in this context. I'm very much with everyone on the micro responses. The productivity growth across advanced economies has been staggeringly poor. And one of the political responses has always been too much government and not enough private. And I think that we need to look at those responses in that area. In particular, I think there are some government responses that have been successful, but one or two that haven't. And also the new opportunities areas ideas, which actually force the school sector and the further education college to work with employers to provide better opportunities and better lifelong skills. And there will be an issue for us to look at those in their mid-40s, I suspect, as there is a structural shift in this economy to a more higher tech level. I won't dwell too much on the open economics section of it, although, I mean, clearly anyone reading this section saying all advanced economies are highly dependent on functioning global supply chains, I think is Ludger's quote, will reflect that Britain will need to think about that in context of its negotiations with the EU and its ongoing relationship with the EU. For although it will give us the opportunity and control over our potentially our own regulation and customs and borders, if there are more checks, which are likely, then there is again the issue about how functioning your supply chains will be, what that will mean for working capital allocation across the corporate sector. And I think we need to resolve that. And there's probably a greater argument here is Britain going to be Little Britain protectionist, or is it going to be Singapore on Thames, or is it going to be somewhere in between? And I think that is an economic argument that we still to settle. I think everybody would agree that industrial policy, I noted the sections on industrial policy, but there are some elements of industrial policy that I think that a government with the right incentives, government's job is to create the atmosphere for business to succeed. So we don't want any return, as I think Harold was saying, memories of the 1970s, Wilsonianism. But I think what we do see at the moment is that in the 1980s, Mrs. Thatcher's reform of the economy led for us to being a shift from manufacturing to services. I think what we're now seeing in a post-COVID recovery, in the sustainable recovery, again, as Tim Congdon was pointing out, really, that we are moving to a much more higher tech, higher skilled, and we need to make sure that we recognise that shift. So there are some ideas along tax incentives, some of the people who suggested a fourth industrialisation adoption fund in the UK, where you incentivise people to make sure that they are adopting the highest quality of technology if they're in that field. And finally, the section on sound finances teaches all of us who have been around long enough to remember the Margaret Reagan, Ronald Thatcher era. One of the things we've surely learned from that era is that it's not how much you spend, it's how you spend it. And I'm increasing, and I think that there is a really good point being made here that we should remember it's not more government, it's better government. And so the argument that we're going to see over the next, I think over the next 2 years is actually Ludger's openings up about, I think, the growth versus tax argument. How much should you start returning? How quickly and how fast you should return to sound finance is going to be encapsulated, I think, in the growth versus tax argument in political circles. And I think the point that taxes are rarely successful in bringing down debt is one that all politicians should remember, because I think there will be a number of people urging us off to one-off taxes, increases in capital taxes. Those are deterrents to entrepreneurism. So I think politicians need to look at the other side, which is how much we spend and how are we spending it. Much as you would hope that with a Tory government that would be good news, I'm always reminded of Geoffrey Howe's adage that all Conservative politicians talk about reduction in expenditure, but they all come to him with a list of things that need to be spent up and increased in their own constituencies. And the political task for Conservatives as we go forward is to look at how that can be reduced. And finally, I think the key point on the last point I think we see on fiscal rules is the point that we as politicians need to remember. You can now announce any number of rules. Some will be good, some will be bad, but there's no point unless you implement them and enforce them. And I think Ludger's point about having rules that are implementable and enforceable is key for the managers of our public finances to remember.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you. John Redwood.
Thank you, Sheila. Yes, well done, Ludger. Very good to have a restatement of the case for limited effective government, for a dynamic private sector, and for a private sector-led investment recovery. I agree with Professor Harrow-James that the huge amount of damage done to the major world economies with the introduction of the lockdowns and the immediate anti-CV-19 policies in the spring did require a strong and immediate, but I think time-limited response from the monetary and fiscal authorities. In the third week of March, we were in complete market meltdown. There was a chronic shortage of dollars around the world. We were threatened with bankruptcies on a very wide scale. And understandably, both the monetary authorities led by the Fed decided to make markets around the world more liquid through swaps and domestic credit currency creation. And we saw governments wishing to cushion the blow of companies not being able to trade at all or having to be able to trade unprofitably with limited revenues under social distancing rules with various kinds of subsidy schemes. But it's very important we get beyond that, because I also agree with Tim. You can't bridge from there to modern monetary theory and say that as from now, we can spend as much as we like in the public sector, raise it at zero interest in the bond market, and create the money to buy the bonds so that we do keep that zero interest. We've already had a noticeable asset price inflation, which was needed because the asset prices were collapsing on a big scale in March, but that would spill over into a wider inflation if they do not take sensible action. But I want to spend my few minutes mainly looking at the nature of the recovery, because it's very popular to say we're going to build back greener, build back better. And this has become almost universal. It was a centre-led idea, really, coming from Green parties and Social Democrat parties and from Mr. Biden, but it's now become rather more universal and has been adopted by all leading world bodies who opine on economics. And as Tim says, they opine rather more political matters now than they used to, because they feel that is the complete consensus. And we just need to examine it a bit. Because I think what's going to happen is you're going to have a mass destruction of capital and a huge investment of capital trying to adjust to this green world we wish to live in. And the danger is that the return on capital falls a lot and you need a massive amount of subsidy, and you may well find you won't get your private sector-led investment on the scale you want, that it will have to be strongly supported by the state sectors around the world, by governments and by monetary devices, which will probably entail joint working of central banks and governments. You may have noticed that the central banks and some of the governors or former governors and banks are now very strong advocates of the green revolution, and they will pledge their institutions or former institutions to green finance part of this package. If you take the case of Germany, all of that massive and amazing investment in those very successful petrol and diesel cars has to be written off well before the end of this decade, because we now have serious countries saying they won't be buying any diesel and petrol cars as soon as 2030 or earlier. So you've got to write all of that off. All those factories have to be written off quite soon, closed down or reduced. And you can't simply start making an electric car in a diesel car factory. You're going to have new players and new factories, and the big value is batteries. And Europe and America have given the game to China because they've allowed China to build this colossally dominant position in battery technology and battery production, and this very big dominant position in some of these special earths and some of the special metals that you actually need to make the batteries. And so the West is struggling to catch up, and its governments have decided that's what it's got to do. It's going to require marshalling huge amounts of capital, and it will have to be subsidized capital or protectionist capital, because otherwise the Chinese could do it a lot cheaply for us, because they're already well advanced. They could expand their factories quite quickly. And the BMWs and the Volkswagens have got to respond to Tesla, because you've got Tesla, the one shining Western example of having adapted and adopted the new technology, often working with China and in China as well, of course. And so you've got this huge tension going on with these write-offs to come. And the same thing presumably has to happen in the whole of space heating, commercial and domestic, because we're all told we've got to rip out our gas boilers quite soon and replace them with heat pumps, or replace them with other technologies still to be devised, like possible hydrogen. And that too is going to require an enormous investment in capacity and subsidy. You already see the subsidy going in the UK, because everybody is told they have to have a smart meter. Not many people want a smart meter, so it has to be provided free, and they then have to spend a fortune on promoting the idea of the smart meter to a very reluctant population. And that's a small example of what's going to happen on a colossal scale. So I think the danger of where we are is at the very point where you want the market to drive what people want, and you want the market to develop all this fabulous digital technology, which people really do want. They love their smartphone, they're buying their pads, and they're getting used to more things online, forced on them by the events of the last few months. But many of them actually rather like this. We want to incorporate quite a lot of this in our lives. That doesn't tend to be very capital intensive. The machinery is quite cheap and it's very scalable. And you've got this huge green revolution coming down the track, mainly top down, mainly demanded by the governments. And I think we just have to sound a warning note that if it doesn't soon discover really popular products that we all want to buy, it's going to come with a very poor return on capital and a massive amount of subsidy and state financing.
Thank you very much indeed, John. And I'll open the discussion to our guests who are attending today, but I think Tim had his hand up during when you...
I just want to make a very, very quick point. We get all of these lectures about need more productivity growth. What John just said, the green revolution is full of subsidies and protectionism. It will reduce productivity on a massive scale.
Ludger, will you bring us back to your points on green taxes as a matter of...
Well, Sheila, let me take a minute to thank also the panel for these excellent comments, and because I mean, when you more even than in a paper, in a presentation, one often simplifies things, and so I think it's very important to stress. I mean, I hope I didn't underappreciate that, but the short-term reaction was indeed appropriate by governments. But we shouldn't get stuck in the thinking on the short term. That's my main point there. And on the point, Harold, by the way, great book on the Bank of England. I had the opportunity to read a significant part of it, so I hope that goes well for you. I also think that the question of how our monetary developments are going to interact and impact on our economies is an extremely important point. I shied away from it here because it's very complex. Because you could argue that money demand went up a lot during the crisis, but now what will happen ex post, and will these liquidity effects translate into inflation or not? I think this is really an important point, Tim. And the related point on capital spending, I agree with you. I mean, some of my messages are a bit simple if you want to derive causality. It's more like patterns that I try to display. And indeed, I mean, whether we need to go back to the capital spending of the 90s or 2000s, that's the question. But I think the key is the framework conditions have to be right. And that brings me to the point, Sheila, that you raised on green investment. I think, the great idea in this area is the carbon pricing. Because the moment you tag a price to pollution, you'll get the market responses to deal with it. And doesn't mean that we don't need government here, and doesn't mean we don't need governments to support the experimentation with different technologies. But the risk is, of course, that we rely too little on the price mechanism and too much on subsidies, too much on the nudging of the financial industry and using the financial industry to do the job of environmental and climate policies. And if you allow me the last point on Stephen with Brexit, I personally think that the biggest, the country that will suffer the most from Brexit is Germany. Because, your departure has shifted the equilibrium in the EU enormously. And I think also that our trade relations are gigantic. And I hope that that the discussions on Brexit will not lead to the type of protection that we all seem to deplore. Despite all my sympathy I have with some of the concerns about the EU and the special needs of the UK, I really do hope that we manage to keep this close relationship.
Thank you very much.
Just like to go back to Ludger's closing remarks, and to me, because I would have made some points. I think the concern. So I think first of all, I would agree with him entirely that the shift inside the EU makes it more difficult for Germany and the UK to act as an axis of responsibility inside the EU, but we're not there, so that's not our problem anymore. Our problem is to ensure, as some people have said, that we don't have double layers, I think, of regulation. I am particularly concerned that I've already highlighted the concern about extra checks at the border and the implications on supply chains very briefly. And I think the concern for the UK will be that although we have said we regain control, the question is, how long will it take to develop our own standards? Are those standards more inducive to the private sector? Will we find ourselves having our own standards and others to comply with? And none of that is yet resolved. So I think there's some real issues for us to confront.
Thank you very much. Harold, yes?
Thanks. Yes, I made a couple of points. First of all, on this question of the Green Revolution and how countries and how markets are going to respond to that. I think it's really a very powerful test case of some of Ludger's theories, because if you think of, for instance, the German automobile production story that Tim Congdon was thinking about, there's really no future for these petrol-driven cars, diesel-driven cars, and the sooner that's recognized, the better. This is then a market reaction, and we shouldn't be thinking of ways of subsidizing whole industries that are going out of business. That would really be the most appalling response to the crisis, the most appalling waste of public money. And Ludger's point about the carbon pricing is absolutely right. I mean, this is the way of getting markets to do a response to a world in which carbon dioxide production is going to be increasingly harmful So what we want to do is to think of ways in which everybody who's in the productive sector, but everybody who's consuming as well, can react to that knowledge and can, as a result, map out an appropriate road to the future. And just a word on the Brexit discussion as well, because COVID is producing an enormous economic hit, an enormous short-term economic hit. Brexit is also going to produce an enormous short-term hit next year. And so the questions that Ludger raises are really absolutely applicable to this debate as well. How do you get out of that hit? How do you ensure that the scarring from a really short-term problem of adaptation is not going to go on and on and on? And that's the question where flexibility, I think, is really required and where a flexible reaction is required.
Thank you, Harold. I have here a question from Anthony Coombs, who's chairman of SNU and a former member of Parliament. He asks, how optimistic are John Redwood and Stephen Hammond in particular that the government, and in particular Rishi Sunak, is convinced of the importance of the deregulatory low digital tax agenda for the medium term? Apologies to Mr. Sunak, adds Anthony. John, and then Stephen.
Rishi will speak for himself. The other point I wanted to make is on productivity, and that is that in the UK, I think somebody kindly said, yes, lots of good work has gone into how we can have more productive medicine. But if you look at short-term figures, we've had a big collapse in output by the NHS because it's stopped doing a lot of non-COVID items. And there was only so much COVID, thank goodness we didn't want any of it. And so actually productivity has taken a huge hit in the NHS, and our first task is to get that back, and that leads on to the answer to the question on the chat line related to Rishi. How do we control public spending? And we simply have to get the productivity levels back where they were at the beginning of the year.
And Stephen, I'll just repeat the earlier question. Does the panel think there is any chance that the UK government will take any account of the need to reduce public spending? Sunak has just promised to run a 100 billion deficit finance stimulus for the foreseeable future. And that's from Thomas Pritchard.
Well, as John said, I think Rishi will speak for himself in terms of the capital gains tax, although, I think that will be quite again, there is a paper out there for all of us to have a look at, and that clearly is giving some thoughts about where they are.
Right.
I've, like many people, heard Rishi say that he intends to return to sound money as soon as possible. So we'll wait and see how he intends to set that out.
Right. And Tim, looking at it from your perspective, from where you are, what do you think of how the government's getting on?
I'm dismayed, Sheila.
Yeah.
We have, as is clear from Ludger's paper, we're living in a world where productivity growth is very low, partly because of the increase in regulation in all sorts of areas of public policy and national life. And we're coming into a period also when the demographic trends are more unfavorable than ever for growth because of the decline in the working age population across Europe, to some extent in the UK. And when, frankly, let's try to sort this out, but immigration is very socially divisive. So this is a time for extreme caution about public spending, and instead we get these, in my view, extreme statements about green industrial revolutions and they're going to spend more on public investment than since the 1970s. This is all wrong. And of course, what it will lead to, as Harold has said, is back to the 1970s, and then we'll need to adjust with inflation and so on. It's all, in my view, inevitable, given the kind of promises and misgovernment that's going on.
Ludger, looking at the bigger picture from where you sit.
Thanks, Sheila. I think indeed, I mean, there is good lessons there. And Alberto Alesina, who unfortunately died very recently, did a great book on this. He called it austerity, I think, to spite all those who claim that, frugal governments is a bad thing. But it's true, and it's also true for the European crisis countries, that those that reformed ambitiously got the best out of the situation. But in a few cases, it meant a couple of years also of a difficult situation. And that, that trade-off, so to speak, between the long-term benefits of expenditure restraint and the short-term implications, that I think is going to be a big challenge looking forward. And that links up a bit also to the question of Harold about rules. I mean, right now we are in this mode to say no rules or as flexible as possible. I mean, you never get it really right. But if you know that in the end, I mean, to get our debt down and our spending down, we have to move to broadly balanced budgets. It's indeed a question of timing, but not a question of principle. And I'm all for flexibility in this sense, but this kind of general questioning of the basic principles of sound public finances and affordable productive spending, which we are seeing now, that I think is a big difference to 10 years or 20 or 30 years ago. And the monetary environment is partly contributing to that, and will probably allow us to muddle through for another couple of years until we'll find that we need to do something. And the inflation word is one, the kind of the acceptance of restrictive policies in a non-inflationary world is another scenario. I personally think that the evidence or the path is pretty much compelling. If we don't want a disaster, we'll need to bite the bullet at some point. Whether and how we go on it is unclear. I'm still somehow, I'm not adjusting my behavior yet to a disastrous scenario. So I'm actually practically hoping that we are going to master this situation, even though it's going to be far from optimal. But still, I believe in rationality.
Righto. As we have almost run out of time, I'd very much like to thank Ludger and congratulate him on an excellent study. I'd also like to thank the panel for raising many questions about, how quickly one has to emerge from this extraordinary spike in spending we've seen this year, considering the context over the longer term, the danger of inflation, which looms, to which our economics panelists have alluded, and the importance of getting back to growth, on which every single panelist agreed today, that one thing we need to do is to start growing our productivity. They have talked about where there are openings even now, which are happening, the digital economy, all the work that is done where we have high skills, high human capital, really developed now, which are not intensive in public spending, capitally intense projects. Ludger had a very interesting figure that when we talk about investment, 85% of investment comes from the private sector. So we need open markets, high productivity, and we need government to control its public spending. The debate we've had today is how quickly we need to get down the debt and the deficit. So I would leave you with a word of thanks for this fascinating analysis, and a very warm thank you and congratulations to our panel for bringing such an interesting debate today. Thank you all very much indeed.